Hello, my name is Curtis Sargent, and I would like to introduce you today to Finishing the Task. Finishing the Task is a network that has been working since 2005 to take steps toward completing the Great Commission. So it actually rose out of the global meetings in Amsterdam in the year 2000. And a group came together out of that event of large agencies that agreed to take responsibility for seeing initial church planting work begun among every ethno-linguistic people group on earth. And so that initial target list of people groups that did not have work among them yet was essentially established by late 2005. And so FTT, Finishing the Task, then began working together as a network to see that work was begun among each of these people groups globally. And there were between 3,000 and 4,000 groups that were identified as being unreached and unengaged. So by unreached, that means less than 2% born again, and unengaged meaning there were no intentional efforts taking place to plant churches among that ethno-linguistic people group. And those groups were addressed at country level. So in other words, if you have a particular people group that occurs in 5 countries, then they need to be engaged in all 5 countries, for example. So between November 2005, when those initial target groups were identified, and now there have been a total of 3,198 of those groups that have been addressed for the first time. And that includes sending over 43,000 full-time workers to work among those target groups, and nearly 90,000 part-time workers, and planting 157,000 churches among them, which is more impressive than it sounds when you consider that these are groups that are starting from pretty much absolute zero, with often 0 Christians and often 0 churches. So establishing new work in a new people group is considerably more challenging than growing work where it's already started. And then there are now more than 3.6 million believers reported from among those targeted groups. So again, that's great progress. And probably very soon, as in within the next 2 years, probably, the balance of those groups will be engaged. So currently, there are 35 deaf people groups and 109 other people groups that are still unengaged from those original lists. And to make it on the list, the people group has to have at least 500 population. So from the beginning, it was recognized that engaging all of the people groups was simply the first step in completing the task of the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations. So as FTT nears its original goal of engaging all the groups, it's now retooling to begin embarking on what's being referred to as FTT 2.0. So FTT 2.0 is taking some next steps to complete the Great Commission. And so that's what I would like to discuss with you now, is the sort of direction that FTT 2.0 is taking. So I'll share my screen here, and we'll talk about FTT 2.0. So in FTT 2.0, the vision is to convene, connect, and catalyze the whole body of Christ toward finishing the task of the Great Commission by ensuring there is a Bible in every language, there are believers in every people group, and a body, a church, in every place. So I want to unpack that a little bit. First of all, you'll notice that in this vision statement, it refers to the whole body of Christ. In FTT 1.0, the original, network was essentially large mission agencies. And even as they began to pursue FTT 1.0, it became clear to them that this was not something that that limited number of agencies could accomplish on their own. In FTT 2.0, it's taking that realization is essentially a step further and recognizing it will take the whole body of Christ to finish the Great Commission. And so it's intentionally going to be making efforts to expand the network in many different ways, and we'll talk about that later. And then you'll notice these three areas of emphasis: the Bible, believers, and body. So graphically, these three B's, might look like this. There's overlap in the work, getting Bibles translated into and available for people in every place, the job of evangelism, and then the job of disciple making and church planting. So, and then all of those are overlaid with prayer, and prayer is essentially the linchpin for all of those efforts. So graphically, that's what it would look like. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the third B, the body of Christ, but we'll briefly mention that for the Bible, there are population cutoffs for just getting portions in the very small languages, entire New Testaments and select Old Testament passages for the medium-sized languages, and the entire Bible in every large language. And that includes languages that are not reduced to writing. So that includes oral Bibles. So there's an entire team that focuses primarily on that Bible B, that first B. Similarly, there's a team serving on the second B for believers. They're focused on evangelism. And I would note there is maybe special emphasis on including online or digital evangelism, as well as, conventional face-to-face and other formats of evangelism. And so there are, teams functioning, focusing on that second B. What I would like to do is dig down a little bit deeper on that third B. In relation to the third B, the goal specifically is to establish healthy churches among every 1,000 people everywhere with fair geographic distribution, just meaning, we're looking at small units, like county or district level or below units, so that if you have, a county with 20,000 people, then you would need 20 churches for that county, for example. When we're talking about church, one drawback, if you will, of having a very broad network is you have people who will have different definitions of what a church is or different expectations. So for the purpose of FTT, we're just talking about a community of disciples of Jesus Christ who are practicing Acts 2:41 to 47. So if you'll remember, that's a brief description of the early church and what they were doing, as churches. And so that, for the purposes of FTT, is what we're describing as a church. And we're also clarifying or placing an additional goal on top of that, that we want them to be multiplying churches. We want them to be making a kingdom impact. In other words, these are not, believers that are not impacting the world around them. They are reaching out. And the short, explanation of why a church for every 1,000 is that sociologically, in most cases, that number of people often forms sort of a social and geographically defined unit, whether that's a city neighborhood, a rural village, the size of a lot of significantly connected digital, places and so on. That unit of 1,000 is a good round number for the sort of the largest number that you can impact in that kind of intimate local way. So those would be the goals, and that would be by the end of 2033. So many people believe that the Great Commission was given in 33 AD. So this would, in a sense, be by the 2000th anniversary of Jesus giving us the Great Commission, commanding his followers to make disciples of all nations, of all people groups. So that's sort of the goals for the church planting. And so what it would be sort of the unique contribution of the FTT network. So one aspect would be there aren't too many networks that are focused on seeking to mobilize or engage or involve the whole body of Christ, at least not in the area of, finishing the Great Commission, in ways that FTT hopes to perform this, this function is by providing a neutral and wide platform for collaboration, by convening, catalyzing, and galvanizing groups to work together on the various aspects of this task by connecting leaders, inspiring vision, mobilizing resources, and identifying and meeting critical needs. And then by also helping collaboration take place among these three aspects. So, for example, from the perspective of the third B on church planting, we can contribute for the first B, the Bible translation, by helping identify existing believers who speak the languages where translation is still needed, or by utilizing members of existing churches to help in the distribution and availability of scriptures that are already translated. The third B can contribute to the second B of evangelism by mobilizing existing believers in the churches that are planted to be doing evangelism themselves, and so on. So there are similar opportunities for the other two Bs to contribute to the third B related to church planting. So these would be some of the functions of FTT. In terms of the church planting, there are some countries where we want to place a special priority or early priority. One of those would be the 12 countries that have the most. And so the countries that have the largest number of people who aren't believers, and I should add, have somewhat limited access to existing Christians. Those the 12 countries that would stand out the most in that regard would be China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Russia, Bangladesh, Japan, Egypt, Vietnam, Iran, Turkey, and Thailand. Those have unreached, not in the missiological sense, but in the sense of non-Christian population of nearly 4 billion people in those 12 countries. So 94% of those countries are not believers. And there's a need for about 4 million churches to be planted in those countries before the end of 2033. So just because of the scale of the church planting that needs to take place, these need to be countries that we prioritize in terms of getting off to a fast start. The second category is countries that have the least access to the gospel. So the 12 countries we've identified to focus on in that regard are Somalia, Afghanistan, Tunisia, Maldives, Mauritania, Yemen, Niger, Nepal, Bhutan, North Korea, Algeria, and Libya. So here you have a non-Christian population of about 280 million. Less than 0.5% are believers in those countries, and there's a need for about 280,000 churches. And we need to start early and focus early on those nations, just because, in a sense, the installed base, right, the existing work already begun there is so limited that it makes it much more difficult to get started working at scale. So those would be a second category of countries where we hope to place early emphasis. What are some of the major tactics, for example, that will need to be employed in order to reach these church planting goals? First of all, we need to identify as quickly as possible leadership teams. I mean, the global task in that is not so difficult as, in some cases, the national level leadership. So we're working very aggressively to get national level FTT leadership teams formed to focus on getting the task finished nation by nation in every country. So I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Secondly, just sort of a Nehemiah 3 type of approach, which is related to the first one. In Nehemiah 3, you'll remember that Nehemiah organizes the people to work on the wall in front of where they live in the city. So this need to work everywhere simultaneously by getting people who are already there focused on finishing the task in their nation, or in some of the bigger countries, even state level type work. Thirdly, intentional collaborations so that best practices can be shared, between regions and between countries, and that there can be resources developed in one region or country that can be shared with another that might have some common languages spoken, for example, or so on. And so this constant sharing of resources and insights across these local units will be one important function of FTT 2.0. And then lastly, making disciple makers so that all of the fruit that comes from these efforts becomes workers in the harvest, that the resources are in the harvest. So we don't want to simply take people who are believers now and mobilize and equip them to do all of the remaining work. We need to mobilize and equip them to do the work in such a way that the fruit of that work joins in doing the rest of the work. And so that will be a focus. Churches planting churches. This is obviously going to be critical, especially, in places where there are already a significant number of churches. Like the first 12, the category 1 type of nations, churches planting churches will be an important part of that. Similarly, starting movements, not only talking about doing the work, but modeling, this type of work, helping equip and involve every believer to be part of this work, so that this isn't just for pastors or church leaders or denominational leaders or agencies or missionaries, involving every believer as much as possible. Innovating, including the use of digital tools, various platforms and processes. There are so many only recently available approaches for utilizing digital tools and approaches. And so we need to work to quickly disseminate these so that many more people are aware of them and can use them, because many of them can be done, with very little time investment and very little training. So we'll make special efforts in those regards. And then also helping, again, the 3 Bs collaborate. The way the leadership team is set up for the church planting, this 3rd B, the bodies portion of FTT, is overall leadership is being provided by Bekele Shenko and Dan Heitzhusen. So Bekele is from Ethiopia and Dan is from the United States, and they're together providing leadership for this 3rd B. Then we have a representative from Church Planting Movement Networks. So specifically, that includes, at this point, 2414 GACX, which is the Global Alliance for Church Multiplication, GCPN, the Global Church Planting Network, Ethne Vision 5-9, which focuses on Muslim people groups, and Billion.global. And we're open to working with additional networks that are focused on movement approaches. And so, for example, I am the representative from those networks to this leadership team. Then there's someone representing research and data, someone representing compassion and justice, someone focused on next generation, leadership, so youth and how to involve and reach youth, someone representing digital church strategies, someone representing church denominations, someone representing the Global Kingdom Partnerships Network, which is a very large network globally of megachurches, then someone focused on fund development. And then in a sense, you may wonder, where is like mission agency type involvement taking place? And essentially, Bekele and Dan are representing that. This team meets together regularly so that we can, first of all, make the other aspects or types of work aware of any resources or tools that we have that might be helpful to them, or can make them aware of opportunities for mobilization or just any aspect. So for example, the digital church strategies people might educate us as a group on some particular new approach or tool that's available, so that we can then make sure our type of workers and people are aware of that resource. So I would make that known to these various church planting movement networks, and then they would disseminate that information within their networks and so on. And so that is what the leadership team looks like for the third B. Why might you want to be involved with finishing the task? First of all, it really is a great opportunity to learn from others and be aware of what's happening in other circles than you normally might relate with. Secondly, the opportunity to collaborate includes the opportunity to track progress. And if you're not connected with FTT, you won't have access to as much information about what the current status of the work. And the best way, if we're wanting to saturate the globe with churches, the best way to get there is to, first of all, know where you need those churches. At the beginning of that process, in any given place, it may be, fairly obvious. We need work everywhere because we don't have work anywhere, for example. But as we begin to make progress, it becomes much less clear. And if you have 20 different groups who aren't talking to each other, even if they all have that same goal, the chance for redundancy and inefficiency is massively greater if they're not talking to one another. Having worked on some large-scale saturation projects before, I can tell you it doesn't happen accidentally. Just planting a whole bunch of churches will not ensure that a given area is saturated if you're talking about a very big area, and certainly not at the global level. one way to think about this is that the situation is much more like a waffle than a pancake. So, if you pour syrup on a pancake, you can get it to spread nice and evenly across the entire pancake. That's great. But if you have a waffle, you have to be intentional if you want to cover the whole thing. You have to make sure it goes in every one of the little squares on that waffle. And if you're like me and you have a sweet tooth, that's important. You want that syrup, that sweetness on every single bite. And so that's really what we're talking about. So if you're interested in getting involved with finishing the task, you can start by going to their website, which is finishingthetask.com. And first of all, you can get a list of those current 109 hearing groups and 35 deaf groups that have yet to be engaged, in case you would like to be part of seeing that initial goal met. And then secondly, you can fill out a contact form or an interest form to get connected to finishing the task people, where you live or where you're interested in working. So I would encourage you to consider becoming involved in finishing the task. There will be national level meetings, probably in most countries. Those will start in 2022 or 2023. And so you could get in on the ground level of helping to shape the FTT work in your country if you get involved now with that, or in your country of interest. These national level meetings will be critical to organization within, each of these nations. And so, I just urge you to get involved now so that you can help shape that work, because 2033 will be here faster than I think any of us can imagine. And we still have a lot of work to do. I mentioned the church planting movement networks. I happen to primarily be involved with one of those, 2414. And if you want to find out more about those, there's another video like this that specifically talks about 2414 and how you can get involved in that. Pray about whether or not the Lord would have you to be engaged in FTT. And I'll look forward to hearing or seeing the results of your involvement in these years ahead. Thanks.